Continuing from our previous discussion on the relationship between Enlightenment and idealism, we now delve into how Hegel sought to push beyond the philosophical landscape Kant had meticulously mapped. Hegel's absolute idealism wasn't just a tweak, it was a fundamental rethinking, an attempt to dissolve the very dualisms Kant saw as defining the limits of human knowledge. He saw Kant as standing at the edge of a profound understanding, the promised land of absolute knowledge, but ultimately falling short, unable to make the leap across the Jordan River into that full comprehension. So, what exactly did Hegel take issue with in Kant? At its core, Hegel argued that Kant's idealism was still fundamentally subjective. For Kant, even our most certain knowledge, like mathematical truths or causal laws, was confined to the realm of our thoughts, forever separated by an impassable gulf from the thing in itself, the object as it exists independently of our minds. Think of it like trying to understand the universe through a thick fog. You can only see your own reflections. Hegel flipped this on its head. He insisted that true objectivity means our thoughts aren't just private mental constructs, they are the real essence of things themselves. Our concepts, our categories, aren't just filters we impose on reality, they are the very fabric of reality. Even the way objects appear to us, their phenomenal nature, isn't just a subjective glitch, but reflects something essential about the objects and their divine origin, according to Hegel's own framework. So for Hegel, Kant didn't just fail to reach absolute knowledge. He thought the dualism itself was the problem, not just a feature of our limited perspective. These gaps Kant identified were paradoxically manifestations of the underlying unity Hegel aimed to reveal. Now Hegel wasn't just pointing fingers at one specific dualism. In his early work, the 1802 essay on faith and knowledge, he made a bold claim. Kant's entire system, with all its famous distinctions, could be traced back to a single fundamental split, the distinction between sense and intellect, or more precisely, intuition and concept. This wasn't just another dualism for Hegel, it was the root from which all others sprouted. Think of it like this. Kant saw different parts of his philosophy, the gap between appearance and reality, the difference between understanding which gives us substantive content and reason which organizes it formally, even the supposed autonomy of practical reason, as distinct problems. Hegel said, No, they're all symptoms of the same underlying condition, the separation between the immediate givenness of intuition and the generalizing power of the concept. And he went further, suggesting that Kant mistakenly believed this fundamental split was unbridgeable, when the task of philosophy should be to show how this apparent opposition arises from a deeper absolute unity. It's like saying Kant saw different branches of a tree growing apart, while Hegel argued they all stem from a single trunk. So, if the problem is this fundamental split between intuition and concept, how does Hegel propose to solve it? He faults Kant for thinking the solution lies in showing how these two different faculties somehow manage to cooperate. Instead, Hegel offers a radically different picture. He suggests the original unity isn't some later synthesis, but an absolute identity of opposites. It's not like you have intuition and concept, and then somehow imagination glues them together. No, the productive imagination for Hegel is the source, the primordial stuff from which both the thinking self and the external world emerge. It's the first reality, the necessary original unity that appears as the bipartite appearance and product of the subjective I and the objective world. Imagine the imagination not as a bridge between two islands, but as the ocean from which both islands arose. Kant saw imagination as the middleman, shoved between a pre-existing subject and a pre-existing world. Hegel says, hold on, the imagination is the ground zero, the first principle. This is a massive shift. It means the very distinction Kant relied upon might be an illusion born from a deeper, unified reality. Okay, let's step back and look at Kant's side of the story. What exactly was this intuition/concept distinction Kant built his entire critical philosophy upon? Kant defined intuition as a singular representation, something directly tied to its object, like seeing a specific apple. Concepts, on the other hand, are general representations, applicable to many things, like the concept of apple itself, which isn't directly tied to any single apple, but relates to them through intuition. Hegel was right to pinpoint this distinction as crucial. But did Kant just pull this out of thin air, maybe influenced by Hume? Or did he build a case for why this distinction was unavoidable, necessary for how we know anything at all? That's the question we need to explore. Did Kant argue this distinction was logically necessary, or was he admitting it was perhaps a brute fact of human cognition, something we just have to accept? This distinction is the bedrock, so understanding how Kant arrived at it, and whether he thought it was defensible is key. Kant didn't just declare the intuition/concept distinction. He developed arguments for it over time. Let's look at some early ones. First, his critique of the ontological argument for God's existence. His point was simple. Just because you can form a concept, say, of a perfect being, doesn't mean that being actually exists outside your head. Forming the concept is purely ideal, not real. Existence has to come from somewhere else, something beyond the concept itself. Initially, he appealed to a principle about possibilities needing grounds, but later, in the critique, he settled on perception, pure or empirical, as the only way to give existence to a concept. This already points towards intuition being necessary for grounding our concepts in reality. Then there's his argument about real versus logical relations. Imagine a ship caught in opposing currents. Saying the forces cancel each other out isn't a logical contradiction. It explains why the ship isn't moving. These real relationships, Kant argued, couldn't be captured just by analyzing the concepts involved. They required something more immediate, something given in perception, like the direction of east and west. Again, this pushes towards intuition having a role beyond mere conceptual analysis. And finally, consider distinguishing left from right-handed objects. You can describe the shape and proportions of a screw or glove perfectly, but knowing if it fits your left or right hand requires immediate spatial perception, relating it to your own body's orientation in space. This again shows a kind of knowledge that seems to go beyond just breaking down concepts into their constituent parts. Building on these insights, Kant's inaugural dissertation formally introduced the intuition/concept distinction and laid out his theory of space and time. He made two key arguments here. First, he claimed that our representations of space and time must be presupposed by all representations of particular objects. How do you individuate objects? By placing them in different locations in space and moments in time. So space and time aren't concepts we derive from experience, they are the conditions that make experience of particular objects possible. This makes them immediate relative to our representations of objects. Second, he argued that our representations of space and time are singular. We don't just have the concept of space, which could apply to many different spatial arrangements. Rather, we represent space itself as a single, all-encompassing entity, and particular regions as parts of this whole. Time works similarly. This singularity, combined with the immediacy needed for individuation, led Kant to conclude that space and time are not concepts but pure intuitions. They are the fundamental forms through which all sensible experience is structured and given. So, Kant has established this crucial distinction between intuition and concept, particularly highlighting space and time as unique forms of intuition. Now, how does he get from here to his famous distinction between appearance and reality, the phenomenal world we experience, and the noumenal world as it is in itself? He presented two main lines of argument in the critique's preface. One is a direct argument, focusing on the nature of space and time as subjective forms of intuition. The other is an indirect argument, using the antinomies, those paradoxical conflicts that arise when reason tries to go beyond the limits of experience. For now, let's focus on that direct argument. The core idea is that if space and time are nothing but the subjective forms of our intuition, then everything we experience, which is always spatially and temporally located, must also be merely an appearance, shaped by these subjective forms. This opens the door to the possibility of things in themselves existing beyond or differently from how they appear to us. It's the logical consequence Kant drew from his analysis of how we know. Let's unpack Kant's direct argument. It hinges on the claim that space and time are not objective features of reality, but purely subjective forms of our own intuition. His first line of reasoning, developed in the inaugural dissertation, was that since sensibility is the receptivity of a subject, and space and time are fundamental characteristics of all sensible representation, they must reflect the special character of the subject, i.e., the human cognitive apparatus, rather than the objects themselves. Think of it like wearing colored glasses. The colors are part of the glasses, not the objects. However, this argument faced a potential objection. If sensibility is just passive reception, why should it distort the object's appearance? Why not pass it through unchanged? Kant's main argument in the critique tackled this head-on. He claimed space and time cannot possibly be features of things in themselves. His metaphysical arguments suggested it was incoherent to think of space or time as substances, properties, or even independent relations among substances. He even hinted at theological concerns, suggesting that if space and time were real relations of things in themselves, God himself would have to possess spatial and temporal characteristics, which seemed problematic. But his stronger epistemological argument was this: if space and time were real, independent features of objects, then our a priori knowledge of geometry, for example, wouldn't be truly necessary or certain. Why? Because a priori knowledge for Kant implies necessary truth. But if spatial properties were merely contingent features of real objects, then our necessary knowledge of them would collapse. It's like saying if triangles necessarily have 3 sides in our minds, but real triangles might sometimes have 4, our knowledge of triangle geometry becomes shaky. This argument links the necessity of a priori knowledge to the subjectivity of space and time. Now, let's be honest. Looking back at Kant's arguments for why space and time must be subjective, they're not exactly bulletproof. The metaphysical arguments, especially the theological ones, feel a bit like pulling a rabbit out of a hat, don't they? And the epistemological argument about a priori knowledge relies on a very specific interpretation of what a priori means, specifically, that it guarantees necessary truth, which some philosopher might challenge. Descartes, for instance, believed in innate ideas that represented reality accurately without being derived from experience. However, and this is a crucial point, weaknesses in these arguments for the conclusion transcendental idealism, the idea that space and time are subjective, don't necessarily mean the initial premise, the distinction between intuition and concept, is flawed. Kant's arguments might fail to prove the subjectivity of space and time, but they still provide a powerful case for why we need both intuition and concept, and why space and time play a unique role as the forms of intuition. The flaws lie in the interpretation of the consequences, not necessarily in the necessity of the distinction itself. So where does Hegel fit into this? He made 2 major claims about Kant's fundamental distinction. First, he accused Kant of having no real justification for it, just relying on vague appeals to experience and empirical psychology. He basically called it arbitrary, like listing categories based on observation, which Kant himself criticized Aristotle for doing. Second, Hegel claimed that Kant, in fact, secretly provided the key to overcoming this very distinction through his own idea of intellectual intuition. This was supposed to be a kind of understanding that wasn't discursive, meaning it didn't just apply concepts to given intuitions, but could grasp objects directly, intuitively, allowing us to know the in itself. These are big accusations. Did Kant really just wing it, or did he have a hidden path forward? Let's examine both claims. Interestingly, Kant himself seemed to anticipate Hegel's first charge. In the second edition of the Critique, he added a passage stating that just as we can't offer a deeper ground for why we have precisely these functions of judgment, we also can't offer a further ground for why our understanding operates only through the categories, and why space and time are the sole forms of our possible intuition. This sounds like conceding that the distinction lacks a deeper explanation, perhaps echoing Hegel's point about it being based on mere experience. But hold on, is this really a retreat? I think not. I believe Kant is acknowledging the limits of theoretical reason. He's saying, look, I can show you why we need intuition and concepts and why space and time are the forms of intuition, because that's how our cognition works. But explaining why we are constituted this way, why we have these specific faculties, goes beyond the scope of any argument I can construct. It's an admission of ignorance about the ultimate why, not a rejection of the necessity of the distinction itself. The arguments for the distinction stand, even if they don't explain its origin. What about Hegel's second claim, that Kant used the idea of intellectual intuition to show the way out? This one is even more problematic. Kant introduced the concept of an intellectus archetypus, or intuitive intellect, precisely to emphasize the limitations of our own human cognition. He contrasted our discursive understanding, which applies concepts to intuitions given from elsewhere, with this hypothetical intuitive intellect that would directly produce objects through its representations. But Kant was crystal clear. Such an intellect is a problem, a concept whose real possibility we cannot even represent. It's a regulative ideal, a goal that guides our inquiry but is never attainable by human reason. In fact, in the Critique of the Power of Judgment, Kant revisits this distinction to argue that because our understanding is discursive and intuition is sensible, we can never fully grasp the necessary connection between concepts and actuality. Concepts define possibilities, but intuition reveals actuality. The very existence of this gap reinforces the necessity of the intuition/concept distinction. Far from suggesting a way to overcome it, Kant uses the idea of intellectual intuition to highlight why we are stuck with it. It underscores the fundamental duality of our cognitive faculties. So, where does this leave us? Hegel was undoubtedly right to see the intuition/concept distinction as the linchpin of Kant's philosophy, the source of its perceived dualisms. However, he was wrong to think Kant intended this distinction to be merely an arbitrary prejudice, or that Kant himself provided a path to overcome it via intellectual intuition. For Kant, this distinction was the hard-won result of decades of philosophical labor, reflecting the very structure of human cognition and deeply embedded in his entire system. The real question then is whether absolute idealism, with its ambition to transcend these dualisms, can truly succeed. Can it reject or overcome the intuition/concept distinction, with arguments that are as compelling and well-founded as Kant's own? That remains the fundamental challenge, the central battleground where these two great philosophical traditions meet.